Welcome to the ICTA podcast, where we think together about unity and solidarity, or ICTA, on campus. In the ICTA podcast, we take time out to listen to students as they share their stories about what has made them feel powerful and powerless in their university journeys, and to hear their thoughts on practical steps that we can take to create more inclusive spaces at UFE. Let's learn differently together. ICTA. Eswale and welcome to ICTA, a podcast about learning better together. My name is Victoria Surtees, and I'm UFE's Internationalization Specialist and your host. In this podcast, we're going to be hearing stories of students from all different cultures and backgrounds, and we're going to be discussing how we can make classes and university experience more inclusive. So I'm honored today to be broadcasting from Civil Radio, which is located on Stalotumuk, the territory of the Halkomelem-speaking people of the river. Our episode today is part one of a two-part series featuring two guests, Leanne Jo and Natasha Rainkie. And Natasha and Leanne are going to be sharing their experiences as Indigenous students here at UFE. They're going to be talking about how UFE's Indigenization efforts are doing and what instructors can actually do to create more Indigenized and decolonized spaces. So as you're soon going to find out, Leanne and Natasha have a really long history here at UFE, and that began around the time that Indigenization efforts were actually just beginning to become policy. So I, for one, am really excited to hear their impressions about how things have changed. And I raise my hands to both of you for being here today. I just want to express my gratitude. Thank you so much for sharing your stories with us.
Thanks for having us.
See it, Tama.
All right, well, let's get to know each other a little bit. Let's start with some introductions. Natasha, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I guess I'll just start with like a little bit of history, but I was raised in BC, mostly in Chilliwack, not in Chilliwack right now, which has been my home for the last 28 years. I am Kluane First Nation, and we are Southern Shoshone descent, and we follow a matriarchal system of two clans. So we have the Crow clan and the Wolf clan, and I'm from the Crow clan. I wasn't raised in our culture because after my grandmother left the Lower Post Residential School, she moved away from our traditional territory, which is located in the Yukon in a small community known as Burwash Landing. So yeah, while my grandma did stay close to our elders in our family and she would visit, she didn't return home officially until my mother and my sister and I returned her to her final resting place on our community's burial grounds this past fall.
So, Natasha, I did a little bit of research and I discovered that the Kluane territory includes the highest mountain in Canada. Wow, so that's what settlers call Mount Logan in the Yukon there. And I just wanted to stop and talk a little bit about that matriarchal system of two clans. You said the Crow and the Wolf. Could you tell us just a little bit more about what that means, a matriarchal clan system?
So before I tell you that, funny story is about Mount Logan. I didn't actually know that was the highest mountain in Canada until after I had my son, and my son's named Logan. So our whole family's like, oh my God, Mount Logan! And it's a big deal. But yeah, so we have the two clans, and there's specific rules with a Wolf clan having to marry somebody from a Crow clan, so you can't marry within the same clan. And it's all about the grandmothers.
Oh, interesting. Okay, well, it's so nice to meet you, Natasha, and thanks again for coming in today. Leanne, it's over to you.
Eswale, Sinakwea Tel Squee. My traditional name is Sinakwea. I was born and raised in Sta'alis, where my maternal grandfather is from. My traditional name comes from Catesy, where my maternal grandmother is from, and her father, and his lineage, and my dad and his mother come from Mathaqui. Both of my great-grandmothers come from Squaw First Nation and Palau, and I now live in Chiactal with my husband and our children. Chiactal is a part of the Tzohuic tribes. I was born and raised Stalo. I did my undergrad as many different things, which turned into a Bachelor of General Studies from UFE with a global Indigenous geography theme. The thing that I am the most happy about from that, though, is my certificate in modern languages for Halkomelem, which is the language of the Stalo people. And I learned that also growing up at home at the school I was at in Chehalis.
And I believe, if I'm not wrong, Chiactal is near what settlers would call Sardis, just for a little context for our listeners. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, and so you speak Halkomelem, that's great. So I know that UFE actually now offers over a dozen Halkomelem courses, from beginner all the way to advanced. Perhaps you can help us out a little bit, a few pro tips as a good speaker here. How do you pronounce the colon in words like Stalo and lalem, as in lalem baker?
So that's lalem, and the colon on its own is not pronounced. It is a indication of enunciation on the letter before it. So Stalo without the colon would be Stalo, but with the colon it elongates the O sound before it, so Stalo.
Thank you, Leanne. And I think we've actually forgot to mention that you both are just finishing up in teacher education.
Oh.
Yes. And so congratulations to you for that. So now how many different programs have you both been in? I'm curious.
So I have a family child care certificate and an Indigenous maps, films, rights, and land claims certificate, a modern languages certificate for Halkomelem, a general studies diploma, a Bachelor of General Studies, and an advanced proficiency certificate in Halkomelem, which is up and coming by the end of June, a Bachelor of Education.
So what you're telling me is you're keeping the university afloat, actually.
You're amazing. Seriously, so much. This is why you're so knowledgeable.
What about you, Natasha?
So I started with an applied business technology certificate, and then I did my bachelor's of general studies because I also flip-flopped so much. I was like, I don't know what I want to do. And then I did the Indigenous maps, maps, films, rights, land claim certificate. And then I went over to UBC for a master's degree, but then came back over here for the Bachelor of Education degree that we just finished.
Well, I think it's safe to say that both you two are very, very knowledgeable about what's been going on with UFE in the last decade and a half. Pretty incredible. So I thought I'd ask both of you maybe if you could tell us just a little bit about ways of learning in your community.
So at gatherings, we still hear our traditional oral stories, which are meant to tell us our history and teach us lessons. There's usually a moral in every story, and sometimes you can pick out a different moral in the same story if you've heard it more than once. Most people hear a story more than once in their lifetime, and every time you hear it, you can get a different lesson from that story. Also, I was fortunate to have been among the generation of students who were being taught the language and culture in school because my grandparents helped along with many other elders, but at the time my grandpa was the chief and my grandma was the band manager and the director of education, and they built a school that really encouraged the revitalization of language and culture. And while the elders were revitalizing language, they did it by teaching the children. So we had language classes and drumming and singing classes and dance classes. There were only a few fluent speakers left then, and they would all come. We would have groups of 3 or 5 people teaching us language all at the same time. Fast forward a few years to now, we only have one fluent speaker, and Siami Atiliot, she works a lot to encourage us to keep learning faster and do what we can. I don't know the whole story of my grandparents and how much they did, but I know that people tell me today that my grandparents were the driving force for the Chehalis Community School to be built, which replaced the Chehalis Day School. And that was one of the schools that was in charge of assimilation of Indigenous people into Western society. And my grandparents were trying to put a stop to that and bringing back our culture and putting forth the effort into having a school that included our culture and language for the well-being of our children and future generations. I was raised with my grandparents, and they really encouraged me to have a strong connection with education in Western ways of knowing as well as Indigenous ways of knowing. And they're the biggest reason that I can be here today, to be able to share and learn and want to learn more.
They sound like really amazing people.
Oh, for sure.
Strong people. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the gifts they shared with you and that you're now sharing with us. And so I just wanted to pause a moment and mention the day schools. So I think probably many listeners are familiar with residential schools, which were boarding schools. So there were about 130 of those in Canada, attended by about 150,000 Indigenous families. So their purpose, of course, was to eradicate Indigenous culture and language, as you mentioned. But day schools also had the same objective, and those are now being recognized as well as doing significant harm to Indigenous people. And so I just wanted to recognize that. So Natasha, maybe you can share your story.
Yeah, so following what you just mentioned, erasing ways of knowing, that's what happened to my grandmother. She lost the language when she left. And I think that's why it was so hard to go back home. And then the relationship between her and other family members became broken down due to it. And she didn't go back to high school, and she didn't finish, and neither did my mother or my father. And so when I was a child, that was something that, like, before hi, how are you, anything else, she was all about, like, get your education. When I was a kid, I didn't really understand why no one graduated in my family. Like, I just didn't get it. Like, I was like, it's not that hard, like, to stay in school. But having this, big moment of just looking back and understanding what they all went through, and understanding and seeing what the intergenerational trauma did in the home, and, my mother's life, and just knowing that, education was something that was used against them. And so I know why my grandma wanted me to finish school. When I graduated in grade 12, it was such a big deal in my family because I was the first one. She worked at Kmart, and she made sure she took the Greyhound down here to get here to witness it, and it was a big deal. And I'm grateful that I got to have that with her before she left. She didn't get to finish. She didn't get to see any of us go to university, and she's a huge reason why I do the work that I do now. And it was during the first 2 years of my undergrad that I lost her. We lost her to cancer in her early 50s. And then not too long after that, we lost my auntie to a suicide that really just kind of destroyed the family. And I think it was 18. And it was like during this period of time that I just really got to understand why people, the way they were in my family with addiction and coping mechanisms. And when I got to go through my grandmother's stuff and I found her testimony for the settlement or the compensation for the residential school case, I got to read in these documents some things that I almost wish I didn't get to read, because I can still hear them and I can still feel them. And, just knowing that her word wasn't enough for the extra compensation that she probably should have gotten. And, there's many people out there still fighting for that compensation, that they are required to have witnesses from when they were 7 years old, 8 years old, 10 years old. And it's just a part of the bigger issue with the system that we're seeing right now. with our government. But it was her experiences that I do truly believe, everything happens for a reason. And I think that it's because of the pain that I feel and the pain that my family feels that I have this drive to become the educator that I wanted her to have when she was a kid and that she needed. And it was just, looking at this period of time that also propelled me onto a really wonderful healing journey that I've been on. And, I've done a lot of deep, deep work for my family and for my kids. And I'm grateful. I'm sad, but I'm grateful. And I just know that, like I said, it was education, but it's also going to be education. And that's where I hope to see changes. And while I wasn't, lucky or fortunate enough to be raised in the culture, I'm also a part of the generation who's reclaiming it. I'm reclaiming all of the things that were lost at that period of time. I'm in the very, very, very early stages, of learning the language. I was accepted into a program when we started the education program at the Yukon Language Center for level 1, but I'm looking forward to also reclaiming that part, because that's such a huge part of our history and our culture, is just knowing how to speak the language that was, taken away from us essentially. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I especially appreciate you sharing how intergenerational trauma has really impacted you and your family. And, that term is actually coined originally for Holocaust survivors. But it was quickly recognized, I think, that term really applies to Indigenous peoples here and across the world. And so intergenerational trauma is when that early childhood trauma is passed from parent to child through all sorts of mechanisms. Thank you for bringing that up today. And I think that maybe that transitions well into our next piece, which is about indigenization efforts and what you're thinking of there, because I think your story has provided a lot of context for the understanding the need to indigenize. So it talks about the harms that the colonial system has created. But it's also talking about, Leanne, you're talking about the practices that we've been missing out on. And so I think it would be great to share a little bit with our listeners about what indigenization is and what it looks like to you. So I wanted to give a quick definition of what it is for our listeners, and I took that from a manual called Pulling Together, which is the BC Campus Guide for Curriculum Developers. And it describes the indigenization process as a process of naturalizing Indigenous knowledge systems and making them evident to transform spaces, places, and hearts. So I'm excited to hear for myself and for our listeners, what can it feel like, and also what shouldn't it feel like for our UFE students.
Yeah, so I actually started at UFE in 2007, as you said, when the university was in its early process of indigenizing the institution. And being a student off and on at UFE for almost 15 years, I've actually been able to witness a lot of the changes that have been made over the years. During my undergrad years, I saw a lot of the physical transformation that was occurring within the walls of the university, with the opening of the Indigenous Student Center and the new support services that were being offered. But I did feel like it was inside the classrooms and the curriculum where changes were needed to really happen. And it's taken time and a lot of effort, but I am proud of the progress UFE has made, especially in terms of what is now being offered for coursework. When I was doing my undergrad, I didn't feel like there was a whole lot of options. So I'm excited to see where students can take their education now.
So can you maybe give us a few examples of courses you're excited about?
Well, just the fact that you can get a major in Indigenous studies. Like, if that option was available when I was a student, I would be so excited. So I am really happy to see that for the current students and future students.
Great. And Leanne, can you maybe share a few experiences on your side?
I first came to the university in 2004 as a part of a cohort that attended a program off campus. in Seabird Island for the Family Childcare Certificate Program. And when I completed that, I realized I wanted to do more. So I spoke to an advisor and enrolled into courses that were leading towards psychology, but then I didn't really like that so much. So then I started going towards business. And when I first came to the university, though, I did not check the box that for me to identify as an Aboriginal student. A part of that gave me a little bit less support, and I didn't really communicate very well with professors. And I went through some difficult things with my family, and I had some cultural obligations, which ended up leading to me missing classes and falling behind. And I just didn't really think anyone would understand or be flexible, and I couldn't really communicate with the professors at the time. So I ended up dropping out and taking the GPA hit. And a few years later, when I returned, somebody from the Indigenous Student Center knew me and questioned why I hadn't identified as an Indigenous student. And she kind of kept pushing me to check the box. And then she also put my name forward to be a candidate for the Indigenization committee of the Senate. Then I was selected and served on that committee in its initial stages as well. I didn't really pay enough attention back then to expect any Indigenization in the university, but now that I see what it was to now what it is, I really appreciate the efforts of inclusivity and reconciliation that we share with not just Indigenous, but like all races and all students with all abilities. That is important to me. Like, it's not just about Indigenization, it's just full-on inclusivity.
So now we've reached a part of our show where I'm going to ask a question that's really important to me and was actually inspired by the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Director at UFV, Sandeep Hans. She recommended that I ask a question about power. So I'm going to ask you now, what has made you feel powerless in your time at UFV, and what has made you feel powerful? So we'll start with that powerless question.
I think overall is still being taught and learning in a colonized system. So I do recognize that change takes time, and there's been a lot of changes. But most of the courses that I've taken at UFV have still been taught by settlers in a very colonial way, and it usually gives little voice to the students. And so, there was times where I would be in a history class and, a teacher would be kind of glossing over the residential school experience. It would just be something that would be kind of mentioned. But just to maybe, give voice to people in the classroom who actually have experienced some of those impacts, or, just also seeing Indigenous teachers in the academy. And I know that could also be for, numerous reasons why we don't see that, but I know at my time at UFV, I had only had one Indigenous professor. So just, not really seeing yourself in the education setting. And one of the experiences that definitely made me feel powerless was during one of my undergrad courses, we were asked to research a food preservation system. And so, of course, a part of my reclaiming my culture has been through education. Any chance that I have to research about my family or learn more about our culture, I seize that opportunity. So I wanted to write a paper on the preservation practices used by my own family. And I reached out to one of my elders over the phone, and we talked about the old ways. She was telling me about how they used the inside of a moose belly to preserve berries and fat as an energy source. They would store those in certain places because, they're very nomadic. They don't stay in one place. And so I gathered so much information during this phone call, and I was so excited to add it to my paper, especially because it was just so close to my heart. And then when I was writing the actual paper, I realized that I didn't know how to source this information. So I reached out to my prof, who told me I couldn't actually use the content since it couldn't be properly cited. And so this was in 2017. I mean, this was well after UFE began their indigenization process. And, I just felt like in that point in time, reconciliation was all smoke and mirrors. I thought, you're here, saying how much you value Indigenous knowledge, perspectives, and culture, and I can't even use the words and the knowledge from my family on a research paper. So I did feel really discouraged at that time as an Indigenous student. And, something that Leanne and I were talking about earlier that has made us both feel powerless here at UFB was the loss of a family member, a really close family member. And it was a loss that just really, when I say destroyed our family, really destroyed our family. And I was close to the end of the semester. I think I had about 2 weeks left, and I'd reached out to all of my profs explaining, and I explained the situation because I was hoping that there would be some understanding, because I had to travel up north. I had to plan the funeral. I had to take care of my mother. I had to help take care of the family. And I was still expected to, come back, and I had to reclaim all of the content. I had to take care of and make up the labs that I missed. And I had to find a way to write these final exams with a big chunk of the course missing. And I failed these courses, and my GPA dropped, and I lost my funding. And at this period of time, your GPA matters so much when you're trying to get to a certain point in your education journey, especially if you want to be a teacher. And so at this point, I just felt so discouraged, and I felt like maybe these teachers don't value family the same way that I do. And maybe it's a system thing, maybe that there's a black and white line, but there isn't a black and white line. We're all humans, and sometimes these things are gray. And so, I did feel really powerless in those situations.
So now tell me, what makes you feel powerful here at UFE?
I think for me, the number one thing that has empowered me on my education journey is just truly being supported by those who care about reconciliation and care about being inclusive and care about doing the work that is needed to get to this place that we are at with some of our educators. And, educators are placed in a position of power, and while I can appreciate reconciliation efforts put forth by UFE, it doesn't mean a whole lot to me if there's no changes actually happening in the classroom with the instructors. So, as I had mentioned earlier, there was not a lot of Indigenous courses being offered during my undergraduate degree, which was disappointing. But there was this one program that I was fortunate to participate in because it's no longer running, and it was the Indigenous Maps, Films, Rights, and Lands Claims Certificate. This program empowered me, helped heal, helped change. It gave me a voice, and it changed my whole entire education journey and who I am today. And it was honestly the first time in my education journey that I witnessed true allyship of settler educators who cared about truth and reconciliation. And what made this program so unique was watching these four men. One was a filmmaker, one was an instructor here at the university, one works for Stalo, and another one was a Stalo member. And I got to witness the four of them collaborate together. And it was the first time that I'd witnessed allies and Indigenous peoples working together in an educational setting. It it really just gave me this sense of that I'd never had up until this point in my life, actually. It gave me a sense that there are allies out there who care to fight for some of the causes, who care to fight for land claims, for Indigenous rights. And, one of the instructors in this certificate was one of my geography teachers. And it was in this course that I truly saw his passion and his dedication. He was somebody who was a part of one of the biggest Indigenous court cases in Canada, and stood behind the elders and did a lot of work. And another person in this program took me on a place name tour, and it was the first time that I ever got to really take in the place that I live in. And I just felt so fortunate leaving that program, and I felt very empowered. And following that program was the first time I got to take a course with an Indigenous teacher at UFE. And it was the Indigenous storytelling. I think it was an upper level course, actually. And this was so unique for me because, like I had said, there was not very many options at this time, and this was getting towards the end of my degree, and I was so excited. And it was in her course. It was the first time I got to share my family's story in an educational setting, and it was super emotional, and it was super healing, and just learning from this instructor and her listening to her story. She really showed me the power of story and how we can use story to heal our families. So that experience, kind of tailing off of the land claim certificate, the two of them just kind of changed me as an Indigenous person, who didn't grow up in her culture. And, I got the both of, I didn't grow up in my culture, but I also grew up with the racism, and I grew up with the intergenerational trauma. And so sometimes I kind of felt lost between these two worlds because, on one side, I was indigenous enough to face the racism, but on the other side, I wasn't raised in the culture, and I didn't get to, experience the close-knit community that I was craving. And so I left both of those courses just so inspired. Sorry, I'm getting emotional just because one of the instructors of those programs is no longer here, and he changed my view on what it's like to be an ally, and just really showed me that there's people out there who care. And yeah, I would say the second most empowering experience after this, and it's the most recent one, is the Bachelor of Education program. I truly do feel like each of the instructors in this program are authentic allies. I do. I feel like a lot of them have done some deep, deep work, and they've worked on decolonizing their teaching practices. And sometimes I feel like every instructor in this university should go through this program, because the way that they teach and the way they show you, you don't see that in the walls of this. And I know it's for, elementary and secondary, but I feel like a lot of teachers could really benefit from getting a refresh. But every course that was offered had Indigenous content woven into it. And I do think that the work that they're doing with the teachers of today is going to change the classrooms of the future. I feel very, fortunate to have become a teacher in this time, because I've talked to, some teacher friends who went through, their certification program 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And, they don't know a lot of these teachings, and they're feeling like they're catching up, or they have to relearn. And I feel very, very, very inspired by this program. And, I was a little bit hesitant on the first day of the program when I looked around, and I didn't notice any Indigenous instructors who were going to be teaching our courses. And I think that's because in the past I'd kind of felt, that if you take a history course with somebody who doesn't have a connection with the history, sometimes it can come off insensitive. I had taken some courses at UBC that, I left feeling like a really bad taste in my mouth with the way that they were taught with the Indigenous content. And so I was hesitant when I got into this program. But now coming out of it, I can look back and say that they all taught it the way it was supposed to be taught. And they all held space, and they actually created a little bit of a healing circle and a learning circle in our cohort, where it wasn't just about the Indigenous students, but it was about all of us as human beings coming together. And I feel like the teachers who are leaving this program are going to make some changes. So that was a really empowering experience, just as an Indigenous educator, but also as a human being.
Natasha, those sorts of stories, they give me so much hope, and they really remind me, of all the work that's still ahead of us as well. And I actually think this is probably a great place just to take some time to pause and to reflect. And for our listeners, if you're interested in learning more about what Natasha and Leanne have shared with us so far, please do check the description below the podcast for a link to a companion resource. So on that document, you'll find a summary of our talk, but you'll also find contextual information and resources to support your indigenizing efforts. So for example, a guide for citing information shared by elders and knowledge keepers. And I think with that, we're going to pause for this part 1. So please join us next time when we hear Leanne's story of what makes her feel powerful and powerless as an Indigenous student here at UFE. And if you do have questions, ideas, or comments, feel free to reach out to me, Victoria Surtees, your host. And please do that by email at victoria.surtees@ufe.ca. Thank you for listening to ICTA, and I hope you enjoy this short clip by a local artist, Saint Soldier, as you consider what ICTA, or unity, really means to you here at UFE. ICTA is hosted by UFE's Teaching and Learning Center and sponsored by UFE International. Music by Saint Soldier.
No matter how long it takes us, no matter how much this world breaks us, may we live here in peace, live here as one, from Bolivia to Greece, from India to Canada and everywhere between. Namaste to everyone I see. Namaste, I recognize that it's one. Namaste, and the suffering is done. Suffering is done, suffering is done. Hey yo, namaste. 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 Hey yo, namaste.